I am Zuri, 35 years old and a senior forensic accountant who spends her life untangling complex webs of corporate fraud. I never imagined the most audacious theft I would ever encounter would be orchestrated by my own parents in the foyer of my childhood home. I had just returned from a grueling 3-week international audit in London. Exhausted and running on black tea and adrenaline, I dropped my bags in my parents' entryway, expecting nothing more than to pick up my accumulated mail. Instead, I found my father Warren sitting in his favorite leather recliner swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. My mother Yvonne was standing by the refrigerator admiring a glossy postcard. Warren looked at me with a smug, unbreakable grin that sent an immediate warning signal to my brain. He took a slow sip of his drink and dropped the bomb. "We sold it, Zuri," he said, his voice dripping with absolute satisfaction. "We needed the cash. Your brother deserved a break, so your dream house paid for their fun." Instead of the screaming or crying they clearly expected, I simply let out a long breath and slowly set my keys on the console. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face as I watched them. Warren's smirk faltered instantly. He stood up, his voice booming with that forced authority he always used to intimidate me. "Why are you so calm?" he shouted. "I just told you we sold your property out from under you." I looked him dead in the eye, tapped the leather folder and replied, "Because the house you just sold was not actually mine anymore." Before I tell you exactly what was in that folder and how my parents unwittingly trapped themselves in a federal sting operation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who thought they could walk all over you, to understand the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. I have to take you back exactly 45 minutes before that confrontation in the foyer. My flight from Heathrow had landed early, and before heading to my parents' house to grab my mail, I decided to stop by my secondary property. It was a gorgeous historic brownstone in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. I had spent 2 grueling years gutting and flipping that place, pouring my annual bonuses and my own sweat equity into restoring the original mahogany woodwork and updating the vintage plumbing. It was my pride and joy, my tangible proof of success in a world that constantly demanded I prove my worth. When I pulled up to the curb, my exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp jolt of absolute confusion. A massive commercial moving truck was parked illegally in front of my steps. A white family was actively carrying heavy cardboard boxes through my freshly painted front door. I marched up the steps, my analytical mind running through a dozen different scenarios, from brazen squatters to a severe neighborhood misunderstanding. I pulled out my keys, but they did not even slide into the deadbolt. The locks had been completely changed. "Excuse me," I said, confronting a man carrying a floor lamp down the main hallway. "What exactly are you doing in my house?" The man looked at me, utterly bewildered, and called for his wife. She emerged from the kitchen holding a thick stack of legal closing paperwork. She defensively informed me that they were the new legal owners and had just closed on the property yesterday afternoon. My eyes immediately locked onto the top sheet of the contract she held out. My name was nowhere on it, but right there, signed in bold blue ink on the seller line, was the name Warren, my father. My vision tunneled. A cold, calculated rage entirely replaced my jet lag. As a forensic accountant, I track missing millions for a living. I investigate shell companies, offshore accounts, and corporate embezzlement. I know exactly how property fraud works, and I knew instantly that my parents had somehow stolen my most valuable asset. I did not waste time arguing with the confused new homeowners. I turned on my heel, marched back to my car, and drove straight toward the affluent suburbs where my parents lived. As I pulled into my parents' expansive driveway, the first thing that caught my eye was a glaring financial anomaly. Parked perfectly in the center of the driveway was a brand new, fully loaded luxury SUV. My parents lived on a fixed retirement income. They constantly complained about the rising price of groceries and gas, always expecting me to cover the check at family dinners. There was absolutely no legitimate way Yvonne could afford an $80,000 vehicle. The pieces were already locking together in my mind, forming a clear, undeniable picture of brazen entitlement and theft. I pushed the front door open, bypassing any form of greeting altogether. I walked straight into the living room, dropping my bags and demanding answers. Yvonne did not even flinch. In fact, she looked annoyed that I was interrupting her quiet afternoon. When I demanded to know how my father's name ended up on the closing documents of my brownstone, Yvonne immediately launched into her signature gaslighting routine. "Zuri, you need to lower your voice and stop being so dramatic," she said, smoothing down the fabric of her expensive new blouse. "You have too much anyway. You have a high-paying job, a primary residence, corporate investments. Your brother Andre has so little. He has been struggling and you know it. We simply reallocated family resources to where they were needed most." Reallocated family resources. I repeated the words, my voice deadly quiet, keeping my temper locked down tight. "You mean like the $80,000 I paid in cash to keep his Porsche from being repossessed last year? I paid his debts while you stood in the front pew at church and told the rest of the congregation he was a self-made millionaire. That kind of reallocation." Yvonne completely ignored the facts, as she always did when reality threatened her perception of her golden child. Andre could do no wrong in her eyes, while I was simply a resource to be mined. Instead of showing an ounce of remorse, she unlocked her smartphone and proudly shoved the glowing screen into my face. "Look at him, Zuri. Look how happy he is." She began swiping through high-definition photos. There was my brother Andre and his white, incredibly entitled wife, Ashley. They were clinking crystal champagne flutes on the sun-drenched deck of a massive private yacht. The geotag on the post clearly marked their location as Monaco. My mother casually dropped the details of their luxury getaway, while I stared at the photographic evidence of my stolen money. Apparently, Andre's latest cryptocurrency startup had failed spectacularly. It was his fourth failed business venture in 5 years, always funded by someone else's money. Ashley, who was accustomed to a lavish lifestyle that Andre could not actually afford, had been threatening to file for divorce and take half of nothing if they did not get a luxury stress relief vacation immediately. I could not believe the absolute absurdity of what I was hearing. "You sold my house to pay for a European vacation to save his fake marriage?" I asked, staring at the two people who were supposed to protect my best interests. Yvonne sighed heavily, looking at me with pure, unfiltered condescension. "You are a single woman, Zuri. You do not have a husband or a family to support. Your life is just work and spreadsheets. Andre is a man with a household to maintain. He needs the capital to keep his wife happy and uphold his image in his social circle. You should be proud to help your brother succeed and keep our family looking strong." The sheer audacity of her justification was staggering. She truly believed that my hard work belonged to my brother simply because he was a man who needed to placate his demanding wife. But I pushed the emotional betrayal aside. I needed the mechanics of the crime. I needed the hard data. "How did you bypass the title company?" I asked, focusing my gaze on Warren, who was casually pouring his drink at the home bar. "You cannot sell a home solely in my name without my physical signature and verified identification." Warren leaned back in his leather recliner, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with supreme confidence, thoroughly convinced he was untouchable because he held the title of father in our household. He was about to admit to a federal crime without even realizing the devastating gravity of his words. "I am your father, Zuri," he said, a smug grin firmly in place. "I used the general power of attorney you gave me." The buyer paid $850,000 in cash, which meant there was no mortgage company or bank underwriter to slow things down with pesky questions. The title company cleared it immediately, and the wire hit the account yesterday. It is done, and there is nothing you can do about it except learn to share. 45 minutes before I watched the color drain entirely from my father's smug face, I was just a tired woman trying to go home. My name is Zuri. I am 35 years old, and as a senior forensic accountant, I spend my life untangling complex webs of corporate fraud. I track missing millions, unravel offshore embezzlement schemes, and expose criminals who think they are smarter than the system. I never imagined the most brazen theft I would ever investigate would be orchestrated by my own parents. My flight from London had touched down early. After 3 grueling weeks dismantling fraudulent ledgers overseas, my body was running on pure caffeine and adrenaline. I bypassed my main apartment and headed straight for my secondary property. It was a gorgeous historic brownstone in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. I had spent 2 years and a small fortune flipping that place. I poured my annual bonuses into restoring the original mahogany woodwork, updating the vintage plumbing, and preserving the intricate stained glass windows. That house was more than an investment. It was my sanctuary, a tangible proof of my success in a world that constantly demanded I work twice as hard for half the respect. I pulled up to the curb, anticipating the quiet comfort of my own space. But as I shifted my car into park, my exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a sharp, freezing jolt of confusion. A massive commercial moving truck was parked illegally across my driveway. The heavy metal ramp was down, and a white family was actively carrying large cardboard boxes through my freshly painted front door. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. My analytical mind raced through a dozen different scenarios. Were they brazen squatters? Was this a massive logistical error by a moving company? I marched up the stone steps, my heels clicking sharply against the pavement. I pulled my keys from my purse and shoved them into the deadbolt. They did not even slide in. The locks had been completely changed. "Excuse me," I demanded, stepping directly into the path of a man carrying a heavy floor lamp down my main hallway. "What exactly are you doing in my house?" The man stopped, looking at me with utter bewilderment. He lowered the lamp and called for his wife. She emerged from my newly renovated kitchen, wiping her hands on her jeans and holding a thick manila folder. She defensively informed me that they were the new legal owners. She said they had just closed on the property yesterday afternoon and were given immediate possession. I told her she was severely mistaken and that I was the sole owner of the property. I stated clearly that the house was not on the market. She shook her head, pulling a stack of legal closing paperwork from her folder and holding it out like a shield. She insisted they closed yesterday and that the title was clear. I snatched the paperwork from her hands. As a forensic accountant, my eyes are trained to spot discrepancies in milliseconds. I scanned the top sheet of the contract. My name was nowhere on the buyer or seller lines. But right there, signed in bold blue ink on the primary seller line, was a name I knew intimately. Warren. My father. Beside it was a notary stamp and the logo of a local title company. My vision tunneled. The bustling sounds of the neighborhood faded into a dull roar. A cold, calculated rage entirely replaced my jet lag. I know exactly how real estate fraud works. I investigate these exact paper trails for a living. I knew instantly, without a shadow of a doubt, that my parents had somehow forged documents to steal my most valuable asset right out from under me. I did not waste time arguing with the confused new homeowners. They were pawns in a much larger, much more sinister game. I handed the paperwork back, turned on my heel, and marched straight back to my car. I slammed the door shut, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I drove straight toward the affluent, manicured suburbs where my parents lived. I sped through the familiar tree-lined streets, the adrenaline fueling a hyper-focused fury. My mind raced through the implications. My parents had always favored my brother Andre. He was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong despite his endless string of failed businesses and financial disasters. They had spent my entire life minimizing my accomplishments while demanding I subsidize his failures. I thought about all the holidays I spent working overtime just to build a safety net for myself. I thought about how my mother Yvonne always criticized my tailored suits, telling me I was too masculine and too focused on numbers, while she praised Andre for simply existing. Andre, who had squandered every opportunity handed to him. Andre, whose white wife Ashley demanded a lifestyle that required a trust fund he did not actually have. My parents had always demanded I share my success, but stealing an entire property was a level of betrayal that demanded absolute destruction. As I turned onto their quiet, pristine street and pulled into their expansive driveway, the first thing that caught my eye was a glaring financial anomaly. Parked perfectly in the center of the driveway, gleaming under the afternoon sun, was a brand new, fully loaded luxury SUV. The dealer tags were still bolted to the bumper. My parents lived on a fixed retirement income. They constantly complained about the rising price of groceries. They expected me to cover the check at every single family dinner. There was absolutely no legitimate way my mother could afford an $80,000 vehicle. The pieces locked together in my mind with a sickening click. The sudden sale of my brownstone, the forged signature, the brand new luxury car sitting in their driveway. It formed a clear, undeniable picture of brazen entitlement and theft. They had sold my home to fund their lifestyle, and undoubtedly to bail out my brother yet again. I turned off the ignition. I did not feel panic. I did not feel the urge to cry. I felt an absolute terrifying calm wash over me. I reached into my passenger seat, grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, and stepped out of the car. I walked up the manicured stone pathway toward their front door, ready to tear their perfect, privileged facade to absolute shreds. I pushed the heavy oak front door open without knocking, stepping into the foyer of my childhood home. The familiar scent of lemon polish and expensive vanilla candles hit me instantly, but today it felt suffocating. My parents' living room was meticulously designed to look like a glossy spread from a luxury home magazine. It was filled with plush velvet sofas, imported rugs, and crystal vases they could barely afford on their fixed retirement income. Warren was sitting in his favorite leather recliner, casually swirling a glass of amber bourbon. Yvonne was standing near the kitchen island, meticulously arranging a fresh bouquet of imported lilies. They both looked up perfectly relaxed, acting as if they had not just committed grand larceny against their own daughter. I dropped my heavy leather briefcase onto the pristine hardwood floor. The loud thud echoed through the quiet house, shattering their peaceful afternoon. Warren frowned, his grip tightening on his bourbon glass. Yvonne immediately let out a dramatic sigh, wiping her hands on a linen towel with exaggerated annoyance. "Zuri, really?" she scolded, her voice laced with that familiar aristocratic irritation she loved to fake. "Must you always barge in here like a wild animal? We were having a peaceful day." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. The training from years of aggressive corporate audits kicked in, turning my emotions into ice. I stepped directly into the center of the room and fixed my gaze on my mother. "I just came from the brownstone on 42nd Street, I said, keeping my tone as cold and level as a boardroom negotiation. "The locks have been completely changed. There is a massive commercial moving truck parked in the driveway. A family of strangers is currently carrying their furniture into my living room, and they possess a legally binding closing contract with Dad's signature on the seller line. I want an explanation, and I want it right now." Warren shifted in his chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. He did not look guilty or caught. He looked annoyed that he was being questioned by his own child. Before he could even open his mouth to deploy his usual aggressive intimidation tactics, Yvonne stepped between us. She smoothed down her silk blouse and put on a mask of patronizing patience, looking at me like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum over a stolen toy. "Zuri, you need to calm down and stop acting so greedy," Yvonne said, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "We sold the property. We had to do it. You have absolutely too much, and you do not even appreciate your blessings. You have a high-paying corporate job, your own luxury apartment downtown, and a massive retirement portfolio. You are a single woman with zero dependents. Your brother, on the other hand, has a household to maintain. He has a wife to care for. Andre has so little right now, and he desperately needed the capital to keep his life afloat." The sheer absurdity of her statement hit me like a physical blow. The absolute delusion required to call me greedy while actively stealing my home was staggering. But I refused to let them see me bleed. I stepped closer to my mother, forcing her to look me in the eye. "So little," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Are you actually standing in front of me right now claiming that Andre has so little? Do you mean the same Andre who drives a custom-built Porsche Macan? Because I have the bank receipts from last November. I remember standing in my office wiring $80,000 in pure cash to the bank just minutes before the repo man hitched his precious luxury vehicle to a tow truck. I drained my own savings to cover his massive debts so he would not go to federal prison for defaulting on his fraudulent business loans. Is that the son who has so little?" Yvonne crossed her arms, completely unfazed by reality, but I did not let her interrupt. "And yet," I continued, my words sharp and precise, cutting through her delusion, "just last month at Aunt Sarah's funeral, I stood in the back of the church and listened to you brag to the entire extended family. I listened to you tell everyone that Andre was a self-made millionaire, a brilliant tech visionary who was dominating his industry. You lied to our family to protect his fragile ego, while I quietly paid his bills to keep him out of bankruptcy court. And now you steal a house that I bought with my own money, that I spent 2 years renovating with my own hands, and you have the nerve to call me greedy. Any normal mother would have felt a shred of shame. Any rational person would have crumbled under the weight of those undeniable facts. But Yvonne was entirely immune to logic when it came to her golden child. She waved her hand through the air, brushing away my $80,000 sacrifice like it was a minor inconvenience. Business has its ups and downs, Zuri, she said dismissively, completely missing the point. You are just a number cruncher. You do not understand the immense pressure of being an entrepreneur. Andre has a certain image to maintain, and Ashley expects a certain standard of living. His marriage was falling apart because of the financial stress. He needed a break to save his relationship, instead of apologizing or showing an ounce of remorse. Yvonne reached into the pocket of her silk trousers and pulled out her smartphone. She unlocked the screen with a proud, triumphant smile and shoved the device directly into my face. You are so caught up in your spreadsheets that you cannot even see the good you have done for your family, she insisted, completely twisting the reality of their crime. Look at him, Zuri. Look at how happy your brother is because of our decision. I looked down at the glowing high-definition screen. It was a social media post from Ashley. The photo was crystal clear, capturing Andre and his white, incredibly entitled wife, lounging on the immaculate teak deck of a massive multi-million-dollar private yacht. They were both deeply tanned, wearing designer sunglasses, and laughing as they popped a bottle of vintage champagne. The geotag at the top of the photo proudly displayed their location: Monaco. My mother was happily showing me photographic evidence that my stolen historic brownstone was currently funding a luxury European yacht charter for a failed businessman and his demanding wife. I stared at the screen, the sheer lunacy of the situation washing over me. My mother was happily showing me photographic evidence that my stolen historic brownstone was currently funding a luxury European yacht charter for a failed businessman and his demanding wife. I watched as Yvonne casually swiped to the next picture. This one showed Ashley holding up a shopping bag from a high-end designer boutique in Paris, her smile wide and completely devoid of any actual struggle. I took a slow, deep breath, reining in the urge to snatch that phone and smash it against the imported tile floor. Andre does not have a tech company, I said, keeping my voice dangerously flat. He bought a massive amount of worthless digital coins on margin, panicked when the market dipped, and lost every single cent of his investors' money. That is not a business setback. That is gross financial incompetence. Yvonne quickly locked her screen and slipped the phone into her pocket, treating my factual assessment like a vicious personal attack. You are always so critical of your brother, she huffed, crossing her arms defensively. The cryptocurrency market is volatile. Everyone knows that. Andre simply caught a bad break. But his wife was not willing to wait for the market to recover. Ashley has very high standards, Zuri. When the accounts ran dry last month, things got incredibly tense in their household. She told him she could not live in a state of constant financial insecurity. She was packing her bags to go back to her parents' estate in Connecticut. She was fully prepared to file for divorce if he did not fix the situation immediately. So let her file, I shot back, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. Let her walk away from a man who has not held a steady job since he was 22 years old. Why does her extortion attempt mean you get to liquidate my real estate? Yvonne looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe disappointment, shaking her head as if I were a slow child, failing to grasp a basic concept. You simply do not understand how marriage works, because you have stubbornly refused to settle down. Andre is the man of his house. He bears the burden of provision. He needs the capital to keep his wife happy and to uphold the family name in their elite social circles. You are a single woman, Zuri. You do not have a husband to answer to, and you do not have children to feed. Your life is just an endless cycle of spreadsheets, corporate audits, and business flights. You have no real obligations. We simply utilized an asset that was sitting empty to preserve your brother's marriage. He is a man with a household. You are just a woman with a career. The breathtaking sexism and sheer entitlement in her voice hung heavy in the air. She truly believed that my hard-earned wealth was merely a communal family fund waiting to be tapped whenever the men in our bloodline failed to measure up. I did not waste my breath arguing against her archaic worldview. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to strip away the emotional noise and focus entirely on the hard data. The motive was crystal clear, but the mechanics of the crime were deeply flawed. On assets sitting empty, I repeated, stepping away from my mother and turning my full attention back to Warren. That brownstone was fully renovated and scheduled to be listed on the private market next month. But let us put your twisted family loyalty aside for a moment. Let us talk about the logistics. Let us talk about the absolute legal impossibility of what you are claiming. Warren scoffed from his leather recliner, swirling the last bit of bourbon in his glass. There is no impossibility about it. The house is sold. The new owners have the keys. The transaction is complete. You can run all the numbers you want, but the reality is already settled. Real estate does not work like a neighborhood garage sale. Dad, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. You do not just hand over a set of brass keys and walk away with a duffel bag full of cash. I am the sole legal owner of that property. My name is the only name on the deed. My physical signature is required on the seller disclosures, the title transfer documents, the closing statement, and the final settlement forms. The title company requires physical government-issued identification to verify the seller. They require a licensed notary to stamp those signatures as legitimate under penalty of perjury. So I am going to ask you one time, and I strongly suggest you tell me the exact truth. How did you bypass a heavily regulated financial institution to liquidate a property you do not own? I watched him closely, looking for the telltale signs of panic or guilt. I expected him to waver, to look away, to realize that his brazen theft had hit a massive legal wall. Instead, Warren did not look intimidated at all. He looked entirely pleased with himself. He set his empty bourbon glass down on the side table with a definitive clink. He stood up slowly, towering over me, puffing out his chest to project the patriarchal dominance he had relied on to bully this family his entire life. You always underestimate me, Zuri, he said, his voice rumbling with arrogant satisfaction. You think because you have a fancy corporate job and a corner office overlooking the city that you are the only one who understands how legal paperwork functions. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring down at me with a look of absolute triumph. He was about to gladly admit to a massive federal crime without even a fraction of a second of hesitation. I did not bypass anything. He boasted, a proud smile stretching across his face. I walked right through the front door of that title agency and sat at the closing table like a gentleman. I signed every single line of that contract legally and openly. With what authority, I demanded, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. With the authority you gave me, he declared confidently, completely blind to the trap he was walking right into. I am your father. I use the general power of attorney you gave me. The memory hit me like a physical strike. 6 years ago, when I was rushed into emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix, I had been terrified. I signed a general power of attorney and handed it to him so he could handle my medical bills and manage my apartment lease, just in case the worst happened while I was under anesthesia. I survived, of course, and weeks later I had demanded that document back. He swore to my face that he had run it through his paper shredder. He had lied. He had kept it safely tucked away in his filing cabinet for over half a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to weaponize my trust against me. The agent took one look at the official stamp. Warren continued, verifying his own guilt with every word. They checked my identification and handed over the paperwork without a single question. The buyer was a private investment group who did not want to jump through the usual banking hoops or wait for mortgage underwriting. They paid $850,000 in pure cash. No mortgage contingencies, no delays. The wire transfer cleared our account yesterday morning. Warren's proud declaration echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the living room, hanging in the air like toxic smoke. He actually expected me to bow my head. He expected the weight of his patriarchal authority to crush my resistance just as it had when I was a teenager. But I was not a terrified kid anymore. I was a senior investigator for one of the most ruthless financial firms on the Eastern Seaboard, and he had just handed me a signed confession. I did not scream. I did not throw my heavy leather briefcase across the imported rug. I did not even give them the satisfaction of a single highly justified tear. Instead, I let out a slow, measured breath, allowing the icy, analytical part of my brain to entirely take over. I turned my back on his smug expression, walked past the plush velvet sofas, and took a seat at the massive mahogany dining table in the adjoining room. The silence in the house was suddenly deafening, broken only by the sound of the heavy brass zipper on my briefcase as I pulled out my secure corporate laptop. "What are you doing?" Yvonne demanded, her voice carrying a sudden high-pitched note of uncertainty. Her expensive heels clicked rapidly against the hardwood floor as she followed me into the dining room. "Zuri, your father is speaking to you. You do not just turn your back and walk away when family business is being discussed." I ignored her completely. I flipped open the laptop screen, typed in my 24-character encryption password, and waited for the biometric scanner to read my fingerprint. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue light across my face. I bypassed the standard domestic servers and logged directly into my firm's proprietary tracking network, a system designed to trace laundered funds through global banking systems in real time. My fingers began to fly across the keyboard, moving with a furious muscle memory precision. Warren sauntered into the dining room, the ice clinking loudly in his bourbon glass. "Let her pout, Yvonne," he said, his tone dripping with arrogant amusement. "She is just running the numbers in her little head, trying to figure out how to rebuild her savings. It is a good lesson in resilience. You can always buy another piece of real estate, Zuri. But your brother only has one marriage. We did what we had to do to protect the family legacy." I did not look up from the screen. I pulled up the public property registry for the county and confirmed the exact minute the title transfer was recorded. Then I accessed our secure banking portal to trace the origin of the $850,000 wire. Warren thought he was a criminal mastermind, but his digital footprint was the size of a crater. I located the exact domestic routing number of their joint checking account. There it was. A massive, glaring deposit from Premier Title Services, followed almost immediately by a massive outgoing wire transfer. When I refused to engage with their absurd justifications, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a defensive, vicious anger. They could not handle my silence. My absolute lack of an emotional breakdown was completely short-circuiting their ability to control the narrative. "You are just going to sit there and type?" Yvonne scoffed, her voice growing louder and more frantic. "This right here, this cold, unfeeling attitude is exactly why you are a 35-year-old spinster. You sit there staring at that screen like it is going to love you back. You care more about those spreadsheets and your bank accounts than your own flesh and blood. It is unnatural, Zuri. It is deeply unnatural for a woman to be so entirely devoid of family loyalty." I hit another keystroke, diving deeper into the digital ledger. I watched the initial wire transfer leave my parents' joint account and hit Andre's domestic bank account. But the money did not just sit there. It was instantly fractured, divided into separate outgoing streams to avoid triggering automated federal flags for large, unexplained transfers. My brother was an idiot, but he had clearly watched enough true crime documentaries to know he needed to move the cash quickly. Warren stepped up to the edge of the dining table, slamming his free hand down on the mahogany surface to demand my attention. "Are you listening to your mother?" he bellowed, the veins in his neck beginning to bulge. "We gave you life. We raised you. A house is just wood and brick. It is a material possession. We are your family. You should be down on your knees thanking us for giving you the opportunity to contribute to your brother's success instead of hoarding your wealth like some miserable miser." I blocked out the sound of his booming voice, focusing entirely on the glowing green lines of data cascading down my screen. I isolated the primary outgoing wire from Andre's account. It was a transfer of $510,000 routed directly to a luxury charter company headquartered in the Mediterranean. That accounted for the yacht, the vintage champagne, and the designer shopping spree in Monaco. My parents had literally stolen $500,000 of my hard-earned money so my brother could pretend to be a wealthy tech mogul on social media. but that left $340,000 entirely unaccounted for. I narrowed my eyes, my forensic training kicking into overdrive. Andre had liquidated an $850,000 asset. If he only needed $500,000 to placate his wife and save his disastrous image, where did the rest of the stolen capital go? I highlighted the remaining balance and initiated a deep global trace through the international SWIFT banking network. "You are a selfish workaholic spinster," Yvonne shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of red. "We never should have let you move to the city. It ruined you. It made you hard and unnatural. You do not understand what it means to be a real woman, to sacrifice for the men in your life who actually need the support." I hit the final execute command on the trace. The software chewed through the data, pinging servers across 3 different continents. The progress bar flashed rapidly across the screen before locking in with a sharp digital chime. A new window popped up displaying the final destination of the remaining $340,000. It had not gone to a business account. It had not gone to pay off Andre's massive cryptocurrency debts. It had been routed through a series of shell companies and deposited directly into a high-yield private offshore account. I stared at the name of the bank holding the funds. It was a notoriously secretive financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. But it was the account holder's name that made a cold, razor-sharp smile pull at the corners of my mouth. The account did not belong to my brother. It did not belong to a corporate entity. I finally lifted my hands off the keyboard and slowly looked up from the glowing screen. The dining room was practically vibrating with the toxic energy of my parents' anger, but the silence I commanded when I finally made eye contact was absolute. I looked directly at my father, who was still looming over the table, red-faced and breathing heavily. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds before I finally spoke. "You sold my house because Andre desperately needed the capital to keep his marriage intact," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling, detached calm. "You authorized an $850,000 wire transfer to save his life." "That is exactly right," Warren snapped, crossing his arms and lifting his chin. "And I would do it again. It was my patriarchal right to redistribute your excess wealth to the son who actually needed it." I slowly turned my laptop around so the screen faced him directly. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the highlighted offshore banking record. "Then I have a very important question for you, Dad," I said, my tone dripping with absolute venom. "Did you know that Andre routed 40% of the sale into a private Cayman account registered under Ashley's maiden name?" The silence that followed my question was absolute. Warren stared at the glowing screen, his jaw locking so tightly I could see the muscle twitching furiously beneath his skin. Yvonne stopped dead in her tracks, her hands hovering nervously over the silk fabric of her blouse. The color rapidly drained from my father's flushed face as his eyes scanned the digital banking ledger I had just exposed. $340,000. It was sitting completely outside of United States jurisdiction, untouched by any joint marital accounts, and entirely under the legal control of Ashley. My brother was not just a massive financial failure, he was a spectacular fool. Ashley was actively securing her golden parachute with my stolen property, and my parents had proudly funded her private exit strategy. I tapped my manicured nail against the screen. "She is leaving him," I stated, laying out the raw, undeniable financial reality. "Ashley is squirreling away liquid capital in a jurisdiction that American divorce courts cannot easily touch. She demanded this extravagant yacht trip to distract him while she quietly drained the remaining liquidity from the sale. You did not save your son's marriage. You just paid for his wife's highly lucrative severance package." Yvonne could not process the truth. Her mind simply refused to accept that her golden child was being played for an absolute fool by the woman she constantly praised. So she did exactly what she had always done. She weaponized the past and aimed it directly at me, completely ignoring the massive crime sitting right in front of her. "This is all your fault!" Yvonne hissed, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill pitch. She slammed her open palm against the back of the dining chair. "If you had just supported him when he actually needed it, he would not be in this desperate situation right now. You forced him into a corner. You selfishly refused to co-sign his massive business loan 3 years ago. You had the perfect credit score. You had the liquid assets. But you let your own brother drown, just to protect your precious credit rating. You care more about numbers than your own blood. I did not miss a single beat. My eyes locked onto hers with zero sympathy. You mean the revolutionary tech company that did not even have a written business plan? I fired back, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the pristine dining room. You mean the brilliant software startup he swore would change the world, which he completely abandoned after exactly 6 weeks to become a club DJ in Ibiza? Yvonne gasped, taking a step back, as if I had physically struck her across the face. I refused to co-sign that massive loan because it was a guaranteed default. I continued, my words slicing through the heavy air in the room. He spent the initial seed money on imported turntables and luxury flights to Spain. I am not a bank for his endless delusions, and I am certainly not financially responsible for keeping his shallow materialistic marriage intact. Warren slammed both of his hands onto the mahogany table, rattling the fine china displayed in the nearby glass cabinet. He refused to look weak. He refused to admit that he had been outsmarted by his daughter and conned by his daughter-in-law. It is a standard tax shelter, Warren barked desperately, trying to regain his patriarchal dominance over the room. Ashley comes from old money. She knows how to protect assets from heavy capital gains taxes. You are just trying to confuse the issue because you are angry that I finally put you in your place. He crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up to look intimidating. He was entirely blind to the financial disaster unfolding on the screen in front of him. He confidently doubled down on his crime, fully believing he possessed some absolute unquestionable legal immunity. I did what a father is supposed to do, Warren declared, practically boasting about his felony. I took control. I used the general power of attorney you gave me 6 years ago. I kept it safe. I remember you lying in that hospital bed when your appendix ruptured, practically begging me to manage your affairs while you went into emergency surgery. You signed away your rights right there in the pre-op room. A document like that does not just magically expire because you forgot about it. I maintained my legal authority over your estate. I stared at him, genuinely marveling at his sheer, unadulterated ignorance. A general power of attorney utilized for a temporary medical emergency did not grant him the right to secretly liquidate my primary residence years later for personal gain. That was textbook fiduciary fraud. It was a severe breach of legal duty. But Warren was too arrogant to consult a real attorney before executing his master plan. I already wired the bulk of the funds directly to Andre to secure the yacht charter. Warren boasted, a smug, victorious grin returning to his face. He needed the capital immediately to pay the marina fees and show his wife that he is a highly capable provider. The money is gone, Zuri. It is spent. It is currently circulating in the European economy, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to reverse a cleared international wire. You can type on that encrypted keyboard all day long, but you have lost. I did not argue with his insane logic. Let him believe he had won. Let him bask in his temporary fragile delusion. I simply turned my attention back to my work laptop. My fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the highly restricted databases I used to dismantle corrupt hedge funds and track embezzled assets. I needed to see exactly how a major real estate transaction bypassed every standard anti-fraud protocol in the state. A 6-year-old power of attorney should have instantly triggered a massive red flag in any legitimate underwriting department. Title companies have strict compliance officers. They are required by strict federal law to verify the current validity of a power of attorney, especially one authorizing the rapid sale of a prime debt-free asset by someone other than the primary owner. The closing agent should have called my personal cell phone. They should have halted the closing until I provided direct verbal or written consent. They did not, which meant someone intentionally bypassed the standard security protocols to push the sale through. I pulled up the title company's public registry, cross-referencing the closing documents with the state licensing database. I traced the specific agent identification number attached to the digital signature on the deed transfer. I watched as the corporate hierarchy of the agency loaded onto my screen, revealing the names of the managing partners and the supervising underwriters. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with perfect, terrifying clarity. I slowly closed the primary tab on my screen and looked back up at my father. He was still standing there with his arms crossed, wearing that sickeningly proud smirk. I rested my hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. You used Premier Title Services for the closing, didn't you, Dad? Of course I did. Warren stated, his chest puffing out slightly beneath his tailored cashmere sweater. He reached for his empty glass, swirling the residual ice cubes with a supreme, unearned arrogance. They are the only agency in the tri-state area that still understands how to do business with high net worth individuals. No endless red tape. No incompetent junior clerks asking redundant questions or demanding a mountain of unnecessary verification forms. He smiled, a wide, self-satisfied grin that made my blood run absolute zero. The managing partner recognized my name the moment I walked into the luxury lobby. Warren continued, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine I was preparing to drop on his neck. He personally handled the closing. We sat in his private office, had a glass of 12-year-old scotch, and pushed the entire transaction through in record time. 45 minutes, Zuri. That is all it took. He took one look at the power of attorney, stamped the closing disclosures, and initiated the wire transfer to our account. No questions asked. Because your father commands respect, Yvonne chimed in from the kitchen island, adjusting a stray lily petal with absolute nonchalance. Men of his stature do not get interrogated like common criminals, they get results. If you spent less time hiding behind a computer screen and more time learning how the real world operates, you might actually achieve his level of efficiency. I did not yell. I did not slam my fists on the mahogany table. I did not even blink. As a senior forensic accountant, I have spent the last decade auditing corrupt corporations, dismantling embezzlement rings, and putting white-collar criminals behind federal bars. I know exactly what the phrase "no questions asked" means in the unregulated corners of the financial sector. It never means efficiency. It means severe, undeniable criminal liability. I kept my gaze locked on my father's smug face as I brought my hands back to the keyboard. I opened a new, highly encrypted tab on my browser. I bypassed the standard public search engines and logged directly into the Department of Justice Secure Press Registry. I typed in the name of his beloved, highly efficient title company. "You are incredibly proud of yourself, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical register that caused the temperature in the room to plummet. "You genuinely believe you outsmarted the system. You think you found a brilliant legal shortcut that allowed you to liquidate a multi-million-dollar asset that did not belong to you, simply because the man across the desk offered you a glass of scotch and a firm handshake." Warren scoffed, crossing his arms and leaning back on his heels. "I did not find a shortcut. I executed a flawless business transaction. I did what was necessary to protect this family, which is exactly what a patriarch is supposed to do." "You executed a massive federal crime," I corrected him, my tone perfectly level and devoid of any daughterly affection. "And you did it with an agency that was already under active high-level surveillance by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Warren froze. The smug smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp look of confusion. Yvonne stopped fussing with her flowers, her hands dropping limply to her sides. The color began to rapidly drain from her perfectly made-up face. I turned the heavy laptop around, sliding it across the polished mahogany wood until the screen faced them directly. "Read it," I commanded. Warren leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the glowing display. The screen showed an official press release from the United States Department of Justice dated exactly 2 days ago. The bold federal seal sat at the top of the page, undeniable and absolute. "Let me summarize it for you, since you clearly struggle with legal reading comprehension," I said, breaking the suffocating silence in the room. "Premier Title Services is currently under a massive federal indictment. 3 days ago, federal agents raided their downtown offices, seized their hard drives, and froze their operating accounts. They are being prosecuted under the RICO Act for facilitating hundreds of fraudulent quick sales, bypassing standard title insurance protocols, and laundering money for offshore shell companies." Yvonne took a shaky step backward, her back hitting the marble countertop. "That is a lie," she stammered, her aristocratic facade cracking instantly. "That is just some fake article you pulled up to scare us." The money cleared, Zuri. The wire hit the account. We saw the balance. Your father did his due diligence. The wire cleared because it was funded by an untraceable offshore entity, not a legitimate domestic bank. I fired back, my eyes cutting toward her with ruthless precision. The men who run Premier Title Services knew exactly what they were doing. They specialized in targeting unencumbered high-value properties owned by individuals who were temporarily out of the country or otherwise occupied. They utilized forged documents, expired powers of attorney, and fake notary stamps to push sales through the system before the actual owners even realized their homes were on the market. And you, Dad walked right into their office and handed them my pristine, debt-free brownstone on a silver platter. Warren's face turned a sickly shade of gray. The arrogant patriarch who had been boasting just moments ago was rapidly deflating, realizing the sheer magnitude of the disaster he had initiated. He reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie, suddenly struggling to breathe in his own perfectly climate-controlled living room. "I did not know," Warren rasped, his voice losing all of its booming authority. "They were highly recommended. They handled the commercial lease for Andre's old office space. The agent assured me the power of attorney was perfectly valid for this type of residential transfer. He said it was standard procedure for family estates." "Of course he did," I said, a cold, humorless laugh escaping my lips. "Because he needed a willing idiot to sign the fraudulent seller disclosures. He needed a fall guy. By presenting a document you knew was severely outdated and revoked, and using it to initiate a massive wire transfer across state lines, you committed wire fraud. You committed real estate fraud. You committed identity theft. And you left a flawless, undeniable paper trail tying you directly to an indicted criminal enterprise. The FBI is currently auditing every single transaction that left their escrow accounts. It is only a matter of days before they flag the sale of my property and trace the funds directly to your joint checking account." The heavy silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Warren gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the federal seal on my laptop screen. He was trying to process the fact that his desperate attempt to fund his golden child's lavish lifestyle had just exposed him to decades in federal prison. But Yvonne was not ready to surrender. Her mind scrambled for any possible defense, any way to twist this absolute disaster into my fault. "If you had just given your brother the money when he asked, your father would not have had to resort to these measures," Yvonne shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "You forced him to find an alternative solution. This is on your hands, Zuri. You drove him to this." I did not even acknowledge her desperate attempt at gaslighting. The financial audit was only half complete, and I had saved the most devastating piece of data for the final strike. Warren swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. He tried to straighten his posture, grasping at straws. "It does not matter what the title company did on their end," he muttered, his voice shaking with desperate, frantic denial. "The sale is done. The new owners have the physical keys. I saw them. They were a nice couple. They were moving their furniture into the house this afternoon. The transaction is complete, Zuri. You cannot undo a cash sale to a legitimate third-party buyer." I looked at him, feeling an absolute chilling calm wash over my entire body. I reached out and gently tilted the laptop screen down, resting my hands flat on the table. I smiled sharply. "Premier Title Services is currently under a massive federal investigation for facilitating fraudulent quick sales. But that's not even the best part. Did you actually read the name of the buyer on the closing documents, Dad? Or were you too busy booking Andre's yacht?" Warren's eyes darted toward the glowing laptop screen, his pupils dilating as he finally prepared to read the highlighted name of the offshore shell company. He never got the chance. Before his gaze could even focus on the digital text, the heavy oak front door swung open with a resounding, aggressive crash that rattled the antique porcelain vases sitting in the foyer. The sudden noise shattered the suffocating tension in the dining room like a hammer through glass. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed across the imported Italian marble entryway, accompanied by the distinct rhythmic thud of expensive luggage wheels slapping against the grout lines. I did not move my hands from my encrypted keyboard. I did not flinch or turn around immediately. I simply shifted my posture, sitting back in the mahogany dining chair, and watched the spectacle unfold with cold, detached fascination. Andre and Ashley breezed into the living room like minor royalty gracing a local charity event. They were both deeply tanned, sporting that unmistakable sun-baked glow that only comes from lounging on the polished teak deck of a Mediterranean yacht while drinking vintage champagne. They were practically dripping in brand new, aggressively loud designer gear, projecting an aura of wealth that they had absolutely no legitimate right to possess. Andre wore a silk tropical patterned shirt, unbuttoned halfway down his chest, paired with stark white linen trousers that dragged slightly over his pristine loafers. The heavy scent of custom Tom Ford cologne washed into the room ahead of him, masking the sharp scent of panic that was clearly radiating from his pores. Ashley clicked across the hardwood floors in strappy resort heels, wearing a flowing semi-sheer cover-up and a massive oversized sun hat pushed back on her head. Trailing behind them was a matching set of pristine Louis Vuitton luggage, the brass hardware gleaming mockingly under the recessed overhead lighting. Yvonne immediately snapped out of her defensive cornered posture. Her entire demeanor shifted from frantic panic to overflowing maternal adoration in a fraction of a second. She rushed toward the foyer, her arms extended wide completely, forgetting the massive federal crime we had just been discussing. Warren visibly exhaled, his shoulders dropping as he physically turned his back on my laptop and the federal indictment I had just exposed. He looked at his son like a drowning man, looking at a life raft, desperate for any distraction from the terrifying reality hanging over his head. But the golden couple did not look relaxed. Beneath the expensive spray tans and the luxury fabrics, their faces were pinched with furious, unadulterated entitlement. Andre bypassed his father's welcoming smile entirely. He dropped the handle of his monogrammed suitcase, letting the heavy trunk slam carelessly onto the hardwood floor, and marched straight up to Yvonne. He ignored me entirely. He did not even cast a glance toward the dining room where I sat. He walked right past my line of sight, leaned down, and kissed Yvonne on the cheek with a hurried, highly distracted motion. "Mom, my cards are declining." Declining, Andre snapped, his voice echoing with the petulant nasal whine of a spoiled teenager rather than a married man in his mid-30s. He pulled his latest model smartphone from his pocket, aggressively tapping the screen with his thumb, every single one of them. The platinum card, the travel rewards card, even the backup checking debit card. We had to cut the trip short and fly back commercial. Do you have any idea what it is like sitting in a premium economy seat for 11 hours next to screaming toddlers? It was absolute torture. Yvonne gasped, her hands flying up to clutch her pearl necklace. Declining. That is impossible, Andre. Your father handled everything perfectly. We made sure the accounts were fully funded. Well, someone messed up, Andre shot back, spinning around to glare directly at Warren. You said the house money was cleared. You explicitly promised me the liquidity was fully accessible by Tuesday. I tried to pay the mooring fees at the marina in Cannes this morning, and the transaction was denied. Insufficient funds. The harbor master actually threatened to impound the rental yacht and call the local authorities. I had to drain my personal business overdraft just to cover our emergency flight home. I sat perfectly still at the mahogany table, my hands resting lightly beside the keyboard. The sheer audacity of his complaint was staggering, a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. He was standing in our parents' living room, openly whining about being mildly inconvenienced while spending $500,000 of my stolen property. He did not feel an ounce of remorse for liquidating my home. He did not feel an ounce of shame for begging our parents to commit felony fraud on his behalf. He honestly believed he was the victim of a minor banking glitch, entirely oblivious to the fact that his loving wife had just robbed him completely blind. Warren stepped forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Now calm down, son. There must be a hold on the account due to the international travel. Large wire transfers sometimes trigger automated security protocols when you start swiping cards in Europe. I will call the bank manager right now and have them lift the restriction. The capital is there. I pushed the sale through Premier Title Services myself. It is not a security hold, Dad, Andre groaned, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. I called the concierge line from the airport lounge in Paris. They told me the primary balance was zero. Zero. Someone authorized a secondary wire transfer out of the account, and now we look like absolute fools. I had to leave a deposit on a rental car with a maxed out credit card. I watched the realization slowly attempt to penetrate Warren's thick skull, though he was still light years away from putting the pieces together. He knew he had wired the funds to Andre's account. Andre knew the funds had arrived. Neither of the men possessed the basic forensic accounting skills required to realize that the remaining $340,000 had already been routed to the Cayman Islands. Ashley stood a few feet behind her husband, adjusting the thick leather strap of her new handbag. She let out a loud theatrical sigh, shifting her weight onto one hip. Her eyes scanned the room, sweeping over the plush velvet sofas, ignoring Yvonne and Warren completely before finally landing on me. The atmosphere in the room should have crushed her. She was standing in the exact same house as the woman whose life savings she had just brazenly liquidated. A normal human being would have felt sheer terror. A normal human being would have looked guilty or defensive, or at least mildly uncomfortable about facing the victim of their financial crime. Ashley looked none of those things. Ashley looked profoundly annoyed. She crossed her arms over her chest, staring at me with a look of absolute, unapologetic irritation. She did not see a victim whose life had been upended. She saw an administrative obstacle, a minor clerical error that was currently ruining her luxury vacation schedule. She honestly believed that I was the one causing this problem. "Oh, Zuri, you are here," Ashley said, her tone dripping with bored condescension. She did not even bother to say hello. She did not offer a fake apology or attempt to play the role of the innocent bystander. She just launched straight into her list of demands, as if I were a negligent bank teller who had failed to process her daily withdrawal. "Listen, you need to call your bank immediately and tell them to stop flagging our accounts," she demanded, taking a step closer and gesturing wildly with her freshly manicured hand. It is beyond ridiculous at this point. We were at the Gucci boutique in Paris 2 days ago. I had a custom fitting for a limited runway piece. When I handed the cashier the card, it was declined in front of 3 different sales associates and a store manager. It was so embarrassing. "You need to fix whatever security hold you put on the transfer, Zuri. We have things to pay for, and this little financial tantrum of yours is ruining our schedule." I did not laugh, though. The urge to throw my head back and let out a hysterical, unhinged sound was incredibly strong. Ashley was standing in the middle of an active federal crime scene, wearing a sheer resort cover-up, complaining that her designer shopping spree had been mildly interrupted. She looked at me with the expectant, dull gaze of a woman who had never faced a single real consequence in her entire 32 years of existence. She honestly believed that I possessed some magical switch on my laptop that could simply turn her stolen luxury lifestyle back on. Behind her, Warren stood frozen in place, the color completely drained from his face. He knew exactly what was on my screen. He knew the Department of Justice was actively investigating the title company he had used to commit wire fraud. But Andre and Ashley were entirely oblivious to the monumental legal avalanche hanging directly over their heads. Andre noticed my silence and immediately interpreted it as an act of stubborn defiance. He stepped around his wife, physically inserting himself between us to play the role of the protective, dominant alpha male. He adjusted the collar of his ridiculous unbuttoned tropical silk shirt, puffing out his chest as he looked down at me, sitting at the mahogany dining table. "You really do not get it, do you, Zuri?" Andre sneered, his voice dripping with unearned arrogance and deep-seated insecurity. "You sit there with your spreadsheets and your corporate passwords, thinking you hold all the power just because you hoarded some cash in a savings account. But you lack vision. You lack the fundamental understanding of how real wealth is built and maintained." I took another step forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You spend 80 hours a week working for a financial firm, pushing papers around to make other people richer. Your entire career is completely meaningless compared to my vision. I am an entrepreneur. I am building a brand. I take risks that you are too terrified to even comprehend. And when you take massive risks, you require massive capital." I rested my chin on my folded hands, watching him unravel his own absurd philosophy. "You should be grateful," Zuri, Andre continued, his voice echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. "You should be on your knees thanking Dad for giving you the opportunity to actually contribute to the family legacy." "What were you going to do with that brownstone anyway?" Live there alone with your career until you die. Family wealth belongs to the men who carry the family name. It is my birthright to utilize the family assets to build my empire. Dad simply reallocated dead capital to the son who actually knows how to multiply it. You are just a woman playing business. I am the future of this family. The sheer breathtaking audacity of his patriarchal entitlement filled the room like a toxic gas. Yvonne nodded subtly in the background, her programmed devotion to her golden son overriding her basic common sense. Warren, however, remained absolutely silent, his eyes darting frantically between his boastful son and the encrypted laptop screen sitting on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to argue with his deeply ingrained misogyny. Instead, my eyes slowly drifted away from his flushed, angry face and landed directly on Ashley's right wrist. Resting against her deeply tanned skin was a brand new, blindingly thick diamond tennis bracelet. The stones caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead, throwing sharp prismatic reflections across the dining room walls. It was a flawless piece of custom jewelry, the kind of extravagant purchase meant to signal absolute financial dominance. I let the silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds, making sure the entire room followed my gaze to the glittering diamonds on her wrist. Is that the family legacy? I asked, my voice deadly quiet, slicing through Andre's alpha male posturing with forensic precision. Ashley defensively pulled her arm back, her manicured hand covering the diamonds, but the damage was already done. Because from where I am sitting, that bracelet looks exactly like the $30,000 you begged me for last Christmas. I continued, my words striking like physical blows. Do you remember that, Andre? Do you remember standing in the freezing rain on the front porch of that brownstone you just stole, crying like a terrified child? You begged me for a cash loan to stave off the foreclosure proceedings on your luxury condo because you blew your mortgage money on a failed cryptocurrency scam. Andre's chest deflated instantly. The confident alpha male entrepreneur vanished, replaced by the panicked, incompetent boy I had known my entire life. A dark, ugly flush crept up his neck as I exposed his humiliating failure in front of his wife. You sat on my sofa, wiping your nose on your sleeve, swearing that Ashley would leave you if she found out you were bankrupt, I said, refusing to break eye contact. You are not a visionary. You are a financial parasite. You do not multiply capital, Andre. You incinerate it. And you just burned down my property to buy your wife a few more months of pretending she married a success. Shut up! Andre yelled, his voice cracking with humiliation. He took a threatening step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. You do not know what you are talking about. You are just jealous. I needed them to hang themselves completely. I needed the final piece of the puzzle to ensure that when the federal agents arrived, there would be absolutely no room for plausible deniability. I needed the physical proof of their active, willing participation in the fraud. So I shifted my tactics. I took a deep breath and let out a long, heavy sigh. I purposefully dropped my shoulders, releasing the tension in my posture to mimic total, crushing defeat. I looked down at my lap, playing the role of the exhausted, resigned sister who realized she had finally been beaten by the unstoppable force of the family patriarch. Fine, I muttered, my voice sounding tired and hollow. You win. Both of you. I cannot fight the entire family anymore. Ashley immediately perked up, her annoyed scowl instantly transforming into a triumphant, victorious grin. She uncrossed her arms, stepping out from behind her husband to claim her prize. But if I am going to call my banking contacts and authorize the manual release of the frozen funds, I need the exact escrow routing numbers, I said, looking up at Ashley with a perfectly crafted expression of reluctance. I cannot reverse a fraud flag without verifying the origin of the deposit. I need to see the physical closing documents you received from the title company. The final settlement statement with the buyer's corporate signatures. Ashley let out a loud, dramatic scoff, rolling her eyes as if I were forcing her to perform manual labor. See, Andre, I told you she was just being difficult. She just wanted us to grovel. She turned to her husband and snapped her fingers impatiently. Give me the folder. The heavy leather one from your carry-on. Let us just get this over with so I can go unpack. Andre, eager to regain any semblance of control, quickly knelt down and unzipped his pristine Louis Vuitton luggage. He rummaged past layers of folded designer silk and retrieved a thick, dark blue leather portfolio bearing the gold-embossed logo of Premier Title Services. He handed it to his wife like a loyal servant presenting an offering to a queen. Ashley marched up to the mahogany dining table and eagerly tossed the heavy leather portfolio directly in front of my laptop. It hit the wood with a satisfying, definitive thud. "Here is your precious paperwork," Ashley bragged, placing her hands on her hips and leaning over the table. "And just so you know, your father was completely useless during this entire process. He was dragging his feet worrying about standard waiting periods and wire verification delays. I had to step in and handle it myself." She tossed her hair over her shoulder, her voice dripping with extreme self-satisfied arrogance. "I personally called the managing agent at the title company. I negotiated the sale terms. I demanded they waive the standard 30-day escrow holding period for out-of-state property transfers. I dictated the exact banking terms to ensure the cash drop was expedited so we could make our first-class flight to Paris. If it were not for my business sense, we would still be waiting for the funds to clear. So you can thank me for wrapping this up so efficiently." I stared at the leather portfolio resting inches from my fingertips. Then I looked up at Ashley's smug, triumphant face. She had no idea what she had just done. In her desperate need to prove she was the smartest person in the room, she had just verbally confessed to actively negotiating a fraudulent property sale with a federally indicted criminal enterprise. I slowly placed my hand on the leather cover of the portfolio, a sharp, razor-thin smile finally breaking across my face. I flipped the heavy leather cover open. The scent of fresh laser ink and expensive parchment wafted up from the neatly organized stack of closing documents. The portfolio was meticulously arranged, a physical monument to their staggering arrogance. There were the standard settlement statements, the deed of transfer, the wire authorization forms, and a thick stack of supplementary disclosures. I did not rush. I took my time, letting my eyes drag over every single line of text, perfectly aware that the silence in the room was slowly suffocating everyone else. Ashley shifted her weight from one strappy heel to the other. She let out another loud, dramatic sigh, clearly irritated that her commands were not being instantly obeyed. "Are you going to stare at the paperwork all night? Or are you going to pick up the phone and call the bank?" Ashley snapped, her voice carrying that sharp nasal tone of a woman entirely unaccustomed to hearing the word no. "I have an appointment at the spa in an hour to deal with the jet lag you caused. Just authorize the release of the funds. You can review the boring administrative details on your own time." Andre crossed his arms, stepping up right beside her to present a united front. "Do what she says, Zuri. We are not playing games with you anymore. The transaction is complete. You have the paperwork right in front of you. Stop acting like you have any leverage here." I ignored both of them. I slowly turned the pages, listening to the crisp sound of the thick paper brushing against the mahogany table. Warren was standing perfectly still in my peripheral vision. He was no longer puffing out his chest. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew I had just informed him that the title company was currently under federal indictment. But Andre and Ashley were completely in the dark, marching blindly into a legal minefield with absolute confidence. "You possess a truly remarkable definition of business sense." "Ashley," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the documents. I turned another page, scanning a supplementary disclosure form. "You stood there a minute ago and bragged about negotiating the sale terms. You proudly declared that you demanded the title company waive the standard 30-day escrow holding period for out-of-state property transfers. You expedited the cash drop." "That is exactly right," Ashley replied, lifting her chin and offering a smug, superior smile. "I know how to handle these people. You have to be aggressive. If you let these low-level clerks dictate the timeline, the money gets tied up in administrative red tape for weeks." I simply told the managing agent that we required immediate liquidity, and I made sure he pushed it through. I paused, resting my hand flat on the stack of paper. I looked up at her, my expression entirely devoid of emotion. "You did not negotiate a brilliant real estate deal," I stated, my voice echoing with clinical detached precision. "You expedited a massive federal crime. Title companies enforce 30-day escrow holds on out-of-state transfers specifically to prevent the exact type of wire fraud you just committed. Those waiting periods are federally mandated protocols designed to ensure the primary property owner is actually aware of the sale. By demanding they bypass that security measure, you actively participated in laundering stolen assets. Ashley's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but her profound entitlement quickly masked her confusion. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "You are just throwing around big words to sound intimidating," she sneered, examining her perfectly manicured fingernails. "It was a family transfer. Warren had the legal authority. There is no fraud. Stop being so dramatic and fix our credit cards." I did not respond to her petulant demand. I returned my attention to the portfolio, pulling out a specific document near the back of the stack. It was printed on heavier stock paper, bearing the raised seal of a notary public. I pulled the document free and laid it flat in the center of the table. It was the re-executed power of attorney. When Warren presented my 6-year-old medically specific power of attorney to the title company, even a corrupt federally indicted closing agent required a fresh secondary verification. An outdated medical proxy cannot unilaterally authorize the rapid sale of a prime unencumbered real estate asset without additional sworn affidavits. The title company needed a witness. They needed someone to legally attest under penalty of perjury that I was fully aware of the transaction and consenting to the sale in real time. I slid my finger down the closing paperwork, stopping at the final page. I traced the line of text detailing the perjury warnings, letting my manicured nail rest directly beneath the bold black ink. I tapped the signature line twice. The sound was sharp and deliberate in the quiet room. I look up at Andre. I was standing there with his arms crossed, still projecting the utterly false confidence of a visionary entrepreneur. "Ashley negotiated this," I asked, my tone deadly quiet and sharp as a scalpel. "That is fascinating, because I am looking at the witness line on this illegally executed power of attorney document." Andre frowned, his perfectly styled brows pulling together in genuine confusion. He looked down at the document on the table, then glanced over at his wife. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "What witness line?" Dad handled the legal paperwork. Warren handled the initial presentation. I corrected him smoothly, keeping my finger pinned to the bottom of the page. But the closing agent required a secondary signature. Someone had to sign a sworn legal affidavit guaranteeing that I was entirely aware of this sale and that I was authorizing Warren to liquidate my property on my behalf. Someone had to legally testify that this transaction was not an act of fraud. The room grew incredibly cold. The silence was absolute, heavy with the impending weight of total destruction. Yvonne let out a soft, trembling breath from the kitchen. Warren took a slow, agonizing step backward, his eyes squeezed shut as if he could physically hide from the reality of the situation. I slid the paper across the smooth mahogany surface, pushing it directly toward Ashley. It came to a stop just inches from her strappy resort heels. "Your signature is right here, Ashley," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute, unapologetic ruthlessness. Ashley's eyes darted down to the document. The confident, bored expression on her face shattered instantly. I watched as her eyes locked onto her own sweeping cursive signature scrawled across the bottom of the sworn affidavit, right next to the fraudulent notary stamp, right beneath the bold, explicit legal warning regarding federal perjury and wire fraud. "You didn't just spend stolen money," I continued, leaning back in my chair and folding my arms across my chest. "You actively participated in forging the sale of a property you didn't own." Ashley's smug smile instantly vanishes, replaced by sheer terror. The blood drained from her deeply tanned face so rapidly she looked physically ill. Her mouth fell in, but absolutely no sound came out. She stared at the signature line as if the ink were suddenly transforming into venom. Her manicured hands began to tremble violently at her sides. "I did not read it." Ashley choked out, her voice barely a whisper. The pitch of her voice had completely changed. The arrogant demand was gone, replaced by the panicked stammer of a cornered criminal. "Warren just handed me a stack of papers in the lobby. He said the title agent needed a secondary family member to witness the closing disclosures. He said it was just a standard administrative formality to release the cash." I did not know what I was signing. I tilted my head, looking at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. You are a grown woman who claims to come from old money, Ashley. You marched into a closing office, demanded they expedite a multi-million-dollar cash transfer, and signed a sworn legal affidavit under penalty of perjury without reading a single word. Do you honestly think a federal judge is going to accept willful ignorance as a valid defense for real estate fraud? Andre stepped forward, his eyes wide as he stared at his wife. Ashley, what did you do? He demanded, the panic finally cracking his alpha male facade. Why is your name on her property documents? Because your father needed a fall guy, I answered for her, my voice ringing with total authority. Warren knew the original power of attorney was entirely invalid for this transaction. He needed someone else to attach their name to the fraud to bypass the final security check. And your brilliant, sophisticated wife, who was so incredibly eager to get her hands on my money and flee to Paris, gladly grabbed a pen and committed a federal felony. Ashley took a staggering step backward, nearly tripping over her own expensive luggage. She looked wildly at Warren. You told me it was fine, she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. You told me you had the legal right to sell the house. You told me the signature was just to verify my identity for the wire transfer. Warren refused to meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, his jaw tight, completely abandoning the woman he had just conspired with. She did not just sign the witness line, Andre, I added, twisting the knife with absolute precision. She signed the wire transfer authorization, the one that routed $340,000 of my money directly into a private high-yield offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account registered exclusively under her maiden name. Andre physically recoiled. He spun around, staring at Ashley as if he were looking at a complete stranger. You put the money in an offshore account? He asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of betrayal and absolute disbelief. You told me the remaining balance was sitting in our joint domestic savings. You said we were going to use it to secure the new condo. Ashley could not look at him. She stared at the forged document on the mahogany table, her chest heaving as the reality of her situation crushed her perfectly curated existence. There is no banking glitch, Andre, I said, delivering the final devastating blow. Your credit cards are declining because your accounts are completely empty. Your wife drained the liquidity and secured her own exit strategy, and she committed a federal crime to do it. And because she utilized a title company that is currently being raided by the FBI, that signature ensures she will be named as a primary co-conspirator in a federal indictment. The room descends into absolute chaos, but it is a silent, suffocating kind of chaos. Ashley is shaking, staring at the signature that just ruined her life. She looks as if the floor has suddenly opened up beneath her resort heels. Andre stands completely paralyzed, his deeply tanned face draining of color as he stares at his wife. I do not let them breathe. I reach down to the floor beside my chair and lift my own sleek matte black leather folder. I place it directly next to their fraudulent title portfolio. I start laying out my cards one by one. First, I place the bank trace printout, confirming the specific routing numbers to the Cayman Islands. Next, I lay down the digital alert notification from the federal authorities regarding the title company. Finally, I slide a thick stack of indexed legal filings onto the polished wood. The atmosphere in the room shifts completely from arrogant, sun-baked celebration to suffocating, inescapable panic. The heavy scent of Tom Ford cologne and expensive designer perfume is suddenly overpowered by the sharp metallic stench of pure adrenaline and fear. Warren realizes that the focus is about to shift directly to him. He desperately attempts to seize control of the narrative, puffing his chest out and deepening his voice to project the patriarchal authority he has relied on for decades to bully his way out of consequences. He steps toward the mahogany table, adjusting his suit jacket with a feigned air of irritation, completely ignoring the weeping woman standing next to him. Now, Zuri, let us not blow this out of proportion, Warren says, though his voice wavers, noticeably cracking on the edges. You are throwing around words like fraud and federal indictments to scare your brother and his wife. That is entirely unnecessary. The power of attorney I used was perfectly legal. You signed it yourself. You granted me full, unrestricted authority to act as your financial proxy during your medical emergency, and that authority has never been officially disputed. I utilized a valid legal instrument to reallocate stagnant family assets for a higher yield return. He looks around the room trying to rally Yvonne and Andre to his side, seeking the blind loyalty they have always freely given him. This is simply a family misunderstanding, a minor administrative dispute over asset management. We can resolve this internally without any ridiculous accusations or involving outside authorities. I do not blink. I do not raise my voice. I simply reach into my black folder and pull out a crisp, heavy sheet of paper. It features a bright red raised notary seal and a vivid blue timestamp from the county clerk's office. I place it perfectly in the center of the mahogany table, right over his fraudulent closing documents. I legally revoked that power of attorney 5 years ago, Dad. I state my words dropping like anvils onto the polished wood. Warren stares at the document, his mouth falling open. He reaches out with a trembling hand but stops before actually touching the paper, as if the physical evidence of his crime might burn his skin. Right after I caught you trying to use my credit to buy a boat. I continue making sure every single syllable is articulated with absolute surgical clarity. Do you recall that incident? You assumed I would not notice a hard credit pull for $80,000 because I was busy recovering. You thought you could just slip a luxury pontoon boat past me while I was on medical leave. I marched into the county courthouse the very next morning and filed a comprehensive, irrevocable revocation of your proxy status. I mailed certified copies to every single bank, financial institution, and credit bureau in the state. Yvonne lets out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. She looks at her husband, her eyes wide with shock, the illusion of her perfect provider finally cracking. Warren, you tried to buy a boat with her credit. I ignore her entirely, keeping my cold gaze locked on my father. He looks as though he is physically shrinking, the arrogant patriarch deflating into a terrified, pathetic old man right in front of my eyes. The swagger is gone. The condescension has evaporated. He is suddenly realizing that he is trapped in a maze with no exits. Using a revoked document to liquidate real estate isn't a family misunderstanding, I say, leaning forward slightly so he can see the absolute unwavering certainty in my eyes. It's wire fraud and grand larceny. It is a premeditated, coordinated federal crime. You actively conspired to steal property, falsified legal authority, and executed an unauthorized transfer of funds across state and international lines. I tapped the notarized revocation with my index finger, the sound echoing sharply in the tense room. The moment you presented that legally dead document to the title agent, you committed a felony. The moment Ashley signed the witness affidavit, she became your active co-conspirator. And because the sum of the stolen assets exceeds $250,000, the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines are exceptionally unforgiving. Warren stumbles backward, his knees hitting the edge of a velvet armchair. He collapses into it, his hands shaking violently as he stares blankly at the floor. The reality of a federal prison sentence is finally crashing through his lifelong delusions of grandeur. He cannot talk his way out of this. He cannot write a check from a drained account to make it disappear. He cannot rely on his wife to smooth over the social ramifications. He is caught, utterly and completely caught, in a trap of his own arrogant design. Andre stands frozen in the middle of the room. His brain is working frantically, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the disaster unfolding around him. His wife has just confessed to participating in a felony wire fraud scheme to funnel money to an offshore account she controls exclusively. His father has just been exposed for utilizing a legally dead document to steal a house. The golden child is suddenly standing in the middle of a burning building, realizing that every single person he trusted holds a match. He looks at Ashley, who is openly weeping now, her mascara running down her tanned cheeks in dark, ugly streaks as she frantically tries to wipe her face with the sleeve of her sheer cover-up. Then he turns his head slowly, his gaze locking onto the pathetic, slumped figure of his father. Andre's tough guy persona shatters. The confident swagger, the aggressive posturing of the visionary entrepreneur completely disintegrates, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, panicked boy who has just realized the adults in the room are entirely incompetent. He looks at Warren. You told me her name wasn't on the deed anymore. You said she transferred it to the family trust. The echo of Andre's furious accusation hung in the dining room, sharp and suffocating. You told me her name was not on the deed anymore. You said she transferred it to the family trust. Warren stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes scraping clumsily against the imported hardwood floor. The authoritative, untouchable patriarch who had dictated the lives of everyone in this house for decades was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, sweating old man desperately grasping at vaporizing lies. I was going to Warren, stammered his voice, thin and reedy, lacking all of its usual booming resonance. It was a technicality, Andre. The trust documents were being drafted. I just needed to liquidate the physical asset first, to move the cash into the primary holding account. I was doing this for you. I was doing this to save you from your own catastrophic financial blunders. Do not you dare put this on me, Andre shrieked, his face turning a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson. He took a threatening step toward his father, his fists balled so tightly, his knuckles were stark white. You used me. You told me the capital was free and clear. You stood in my kitchen, drank my scotch, and looked me dead in the eye and swore you had the absolute legal authority to sell that brownstone. You made me drag my wife into a federal felony. Ashley let out a loud, wretched sob from her place near the mahogany table. She was completely broken, her expensive resort wear looking absurdly out of place against her posture of total defeat. She clutched her head in her hands, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light in a mocking display of the wealth she was about to lose entirely. Yvonne could no longer remain safely tucked away in the kitchen. The programmed illusion of her perfect family was shattering, and her maternal programming overrode her self-preservation. She rushed forward, grabbing Andre's arm, her designer bracelets clanking together. Andre, please stop shouting at your father! Yvonne pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. He made a mistake. We all make mistakes. We can hire lawyers. We can fix this. We just need to give back the money. Zuri will drop this ridiculous crusade once we return the funds. Right, Zuri. We just reverse the wire transfer and this all goes away. We are family. Andre violently yanked his arm out of his mother's grasp. His face contorted with a mixture of disgust and absolute panic. Give back the money. Andre mocked, his voice breaking into a hysterical laugh. Are you entirely deaf, Mom? Did you not hear a single word she just said? The money is in the Cayman Islands. It is locked in an offshore shell account that Ashley set up to hide the funds from domestic creditors. We cannot just wire it back. The federal government is already involved. We are going to prison. The word prison hung in the air like a physical weight. Yvonne gasped, taking a stumbling step back, her hands flying to her throat. She looked at Warren, begging him to fix it, begging him to assert his dominance and make the scary words go away. But Warren was staring at the floor, his chest heaving, utterly incapable of saving himself, let alone his wife or his golden son. I watched the glorious total destruction of their family dynamic with cold clinical satisfaction. They were finally experiencing the exact terror they had so casually inflicted upon me when they decided my life savings were simply a resource for their convenience. But I was not finished. The trap I had laid was far deeper than they could possibly comprehend. I shifted my chair closer to the table. The subtle movement immediately drew their panicked eyes back to me. I was the apex predator in the room, and they were finally painfully aware of their status as prey. I reached out and placed my hand on the sleek aluminum chassis of my laptop. With a swift, fluid motion, I swiveled the computer around so the high-definition screen faced directly toward Warren and Andre. The bright, sterile glow of the monitor illuminated their terrified faces. I tapped the trackpad to wake the screen, pulling up a highly confidential encrypted email from my corporate attorney. The subject line read simply, DOJ indictment, Premier Title Services, confidential. I want you to read this very carefully, Dad. I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that commanded absolute silence in the room. This is a direct communication from my lead corporate litigator. He specializes in federal asset recovery and organized crime. Warren squinted at the screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. Andre leaned in slightly, his eyes tracking the dense paragraphs of legal terminology and federal case numbers. You see, the two of you have spent your entire lives operating under the delusion that you are the smartest men in any given room, I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if I were lecturing a pair of particularly slow interns. You honestly believe that you could just bully a title agent, forge a few signatures, and walk away with $500,000. You thought your aggressive posturing and Ashley's obnoxious entitlement somehow magically bypassed the stringent federally mandated security protocols required for an out-of-state property liquidation. I stood up slowly, planting my hands on the mahogany table and leaning over the keyboard. But you did not outsmart anyone, I stated, locking eyes with my father. The title company you used did not just get lucky or lazy. They did not push your fraudulent transaction through because Ashley demanded it, or because you wore a nice suit to the closing office. Warren swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his temple. What are you saying? Saying, he whispered, the sound barely escaping his throat. I am saying that Premier Title Services has been under active federal investigation for the past 14 months, I answered, enjoying the visible tremor that violently shook my father's shoulders. The Department of Justice discovered they were operating as a regional clearinghouse for an organized money laundering syndicate. The federal government has been monitoring every single phone call, every single email, and every single wire transfer that entered or exited that building since last year. Ashley's head snapped up from her hands. Her tear-streaked face was a mask of unadulterated horror. She looked at the laptop screen, her eyes wide and unblinking. The specific title agent who handled your closing, the man you sat across from, the man Ashley aggressively bullied into waiving the 30-day escrow hold. I continued, my voice steady and rhythmic. His name is Marcus. Marcus was caught laundering cartel funds 8 months ago. Facing 20 years in federal lockup, Marcus made a very practical decision. He became a cooperating witness for the federal government. Yvonne let out a soft, whimpering moan, sinking onto the arm of the velvet sofa as her legs completely gave out. Andre took a step backward, bumping heavily into the dining room wall. Every single conversation you had in that office was recorded. I informed them, ensuring the reality of their situation penetrated their thick skulls. When you handed over that revoked, legally dead power of attorney, the federal government logged it. When Ashley threw a tantrum and demanded the cash drop be expedited to an offshore account, the federal government recorded it. The agent who approved your fraudulent paperwork was a federal informant wearing a wire. Warren gripped the back of a dining chair, his knuckles turning white as he desperately tried to keep himself upright. He looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the imported marble. They knew the power of attorney was revoked. Warren gasped, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for hidden cameras. They knew it was fraud from the very beginning. Why did they let the transfer go through? Why did they release the funds to Andre's account? I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, predatory grin of a woman who had meticulously engineered the absolute destruction of her abusers. They let you sell the house, Dad. They let you push the wire transfer through because they needed to catch you committing the crime to build their RICO case. The echo of Andre's furious accusation hung in the dining room, sharp and suffocating. Warren stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes scraping clumsily against the imported hardwood floor. The authoritative, untouchable patriarch who had dictated the lives of everyone in this house for decades was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, sweating old man, desperately grasping at vaporizing lies. I was going to, Warren stammered, his voice thin and reedy, lacking all of its usual booming resonance. It was a technicality, Andre. The trust documents were being drafted. I just needed to liquidate the physical asset first, to move the cash into the primary holding account. I was doing this for you. I was doing this to save you from your own catastrophic financial blunders. Do not you dare put this on me, Andre shrieked, his face turning a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson. He took a threatening step toward his father, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles were stark white. You used me. You told me the capital was free and clear. You stood in my kitchen, drank my scotch, and looked me dead in the eye and swore you had the absolute legal authority to sell that brownstone. You made me drag my wife into a federal felony. Ashley let out a loud, wretched sob from her place near the mahogany table. She was completely broken, her expensive resort wear looking absurdly out of place against her posture of total defeat. She clutched her head in her hands, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light in a mocking display of the wealth she was about to lose entirely. Yvonne could no longer remain safely tucked away in the kitchen. The programmed illusion of her perfect family was shattering, and her maternal programming overrode her self-preservation. She rushed forward, grabbing Andre's arm, her designer bracelets clanking together. "Andre, please stop shouting at your father," Yvonne pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. "He made a mistake. We all make mistakes. We can hire lawyers. We can fix this. We just need to give back the money. Zuri will drop this ridiculous crusade once we return the funds." "Right, Zuri. We just reverse the wire transfer and this all goes away. We are family." Andre violently yanked his arm out of his mother's grasp. His face contorted with a mixture of disgust and absolute panic. "Give back the money!" Andre mocked, his voice breaking into a hysterical laugh. "Are you entirely deaf, Mom? Did you not hear a single word she just said? The money is in the Cayman Islands. It is locked in an offshore shell account that Ashley set up to hide the funds from domestic creditors. We cannot just wire it back. The federal government is already involved. We are going to prison." The word prison hung in the air like a physical weight. Yvonne gasped, taking a stumbling step back, her hands flying to her throat. She looked at Warren, begging him to fix it, begging him to assert his dominance and make the scary words go away. But Warren was staring at the floor, his chest heaving, utterly incapable of saving himself, let alone his wife or his golden son. I watched the glorious total destruction of their family dynamic with cold clinical satisfaction. They were finally experiencing the exact terror they had so casually inflicted upon me when they decided my life savings were simply a resource for their convenience. But I was not finished. The trap I had laid was far deeper than they could possibly comprehend. I shifted my chair closer to the table. The subtle movement immediately drew their panicked eyes back to me. I was the apex predator in the room, and they were finally painfully aware of their status as prey. I reached out and placed my hand on the sleek aluminum chassis of my laptop. With a swift, fluid motion, I swiveled the computer around so the high-definition screen faced directly toward Warren and Andre. The bright, sterile glow of the monitor illuminated their terrified faces. I tapped the trackpad to wake the screen, pulling up a highly confidential encrypted email from my corporate attorney. The subject line read simply, "DOJ indictment, Premier Title Services, confidential. I want you to read this very carefully." "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that demanded absolute silence in the room. "This is a direct communication from my lead corporate litigator. He specializes in federal asset recovery and organized crime." Warren squinted at the screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. Andre leaned in slightly, his eyes tracking the dense paragraphs of legal terminology and federal case numbers. "You see, the two of you have spent your entire lives operating under the delusion that you are the smartest men in any given room," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if I were lecturing a pair of particularly slow interns. "You honestly believe that you could just bully a title agent, forge a few signatures, and walk away with $500,000. You thought your aggressive posturing and Ashley's obnoxious entitlement somehow magically bypassed the stringent federally mandated security protocols required for an out-of-state property liquidation." I stood up slowly, planting my hands on the mahogany table and leaning over the keyboard. "But you did not outsmart anyone," I stated, locking eyes with my father. "The title company you used did not just get lucky or lazy. They did not push your fraudulent transaction through because Ashley demanded it, or because you wore a nice suit to the closing office." Warren swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his temple. "What are you saying?" He whispered, the sound barely escaping his throat. "I am saying that Premier Title Services has been under active federal investigation for the past 14 months, I answered, enjoying the visible tremor that violently shook my father's shoulders. The Department of Justice discovered they were operating as a regional clearinghouse for an organized money laundering syndicate. The federal government has been monitoring every single phone call, every single email, and every single wire transfer that entered or exited that building since last year." Ashley's head snapped up from her hands. Her tear-streaked face was a mask of unadulterated horror. She looked at the laptop screen, her eyes wide and unblinking. "The specific title agent who handled your closing, the man you sat across from the man." Ashley aggressively bullied into waiving the 30-day escrow hold. I continued, my voice steady and rhythmic. "His name is Marcus. Marcus was caught laundering cartel funds 8 months ago, facing 20 years in federal lockup. Marcus made a very practical decision. He became a cooperating witness for the federal government." Yvonne let out a soft, whimpering moan, sinking onto the arm of the velvet sofa as her legs completely gave out. Andre took a step backward, bumping heavily into the dining room wall. "Every single conversation you had in that office was recorded. I informed them, ensuring the reality of their situation penetrated their thick skulls. When you handed over that revoked legally dead power of attorney, the federal government logged it. When Ashley threw a tantrum and demanded the cash drop be expedited to an offshore account, the federal government recorded it. The agent who approved your fraudulent paperwork was a federal informant wearing a wire." Total chaos erupted. The fragile illusion of control completely dissolved into absolute visceral panic. Ashley let out a piercing, guttural shriek. The reality of the situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. She was not just a participant in a family dispute. She was actively tied to a federal RICO investigation. Her carefully guarded offshore account was not a safe haven. It was a frozen, monitored honey trap that the Department of Justice was actively watching. She spun around, her eyes wild and bloodshot, and turned her wrath entirely on her husband. "You lied to me," Ashley screamed, her voice tearing through the room. She lunged at Andre, her manicured acrylic nails grabbing fistfuls of his expensive silk shirt. "You told me the brownstone was a shared asset. You swore your father had the legal right to sell it. You told me the money was clean." Andre tried to grab her wrists, trying desperately to pry her off him. "Ash, stop. Listen to me. I did not know. My dad set the whole thing up. He told me the deed was transferred. I thought it was estate money." "I do not care what you thought, you pathetic bankrupt loser," Ashley roared, shaking him violently. "You maxed out our credit cards. You drained our savings on your stupid fake business ventures. And now you have dragged me into a federal wire fraud conspiracy with an informant. My account is frozen. I am tied to a cartel investigation. I have absolutely nothing because of you." She shoved him backward with surprising force, her chest heaving as she backed away from him as if he were diseased. Yvonne, utterly incapable of watching her golden boy be attacked, rushed forward. She was crying now, her perfect makeup ruined, operating purely on her delusional need to enforce family unity. "Ashley, please, sweetheart," Yvonne begged, reaching out with trembling hands to touch her daughter-in-law's arm. "We just need to calm down. We are family. We do not turn on each other. Warren will hire the best defense attorneys. We will protect you. We just have to stick together." The moment Yvonne's fingers brushed her arm, Ashley snapped. All the polite country club civility she had faked for years vanished instantly. Her white privilege, deeply ingrained and entirely unbothered by the concept of consequence, flared up in full, ugly force. Ashley violently shoved Yvonne away. She struck my mother hard in the chest, sending Yvonne stumbling backward until she crashed into the armrest of the velvet sofa. "Do not touch me," Ashley hissed, her face contorted with absolute disgust. "I am not your family. I will never go down with you people." She snatched her brand new oversized designer handbag off the floor, her hands shaking as she dug frantically for her smartphone. "I am calling my father's lawyers right now," Ashley threatened, glaring at Andre and Warren with pure, unadulterated venom. "My family has real money. We have real connections. Do you think I'm going to let some incompetent wannabe real estate scammers drag me into federal prison? I will demand an immunity deal. I will testify against both of you. We will crush you people to keep me out of a cell." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Ashley frantically dialing her phone in the corner. Yvonne sat frozen on the sofa, clutching her chest, staring in horror at the woman she had idolized, finally realizing she was entirely disposable. Andre stood perfectly still, utterly emasculated and discarded. Warren, sweating profusely, his face pale and glistening under the chandelier light, realized the threat was immediate and catastrophic. His own daughter-in-law was about to turn state's evidence against him. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table to keep from collapsing. His survival instincts kicked in, and he resorted to the only tactic he knew. He tried to buy his way out. He desperately tried to negotiate a business solution to a federal crime. "Fine," Warren shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He threw his hands up in the air, looking at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "Fine. You win, Zuri. You proved your point. We will undo the transaction." He took a frantic step toward the table, pointing at the laptop. "We will just give the money back to the buyer." Warren babbled, his words rushing out in a panicked stream. "I will liquidate my retirement accounts. I will take out a second mortgage on this house. I do not care what it costs. We will scrape together the entire amount, and we will reverse the sale, Zuri. It has only been a few days. We can claim it was a clerical error." He leaned over the table, begging me with his eyes. "Just pick up your phone, call the new owners, tell them there was a miscommunication regarding the title. We will return their capital and cancel the deed transfer. We can make this completely disappear. Just call them and cancel it." I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my tailored slacks. I looked at the terrified, broken old man standing across from me. I had allowed them to dig their own graves, driven entirely by their own arrogance. I reached out and placed both hands on the edge of the laptop monitor. I closed the laptop with a loud, definitive snap that echoed through the room like a gavel striking wood. "I can't do that, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any mercy. "Because the buyer isn't a person." The words hung in the stale air of the dining room, sharp and unforgiving. Warren blinked, his bleary, bloodshot eyes darting around the room as if searching for a translator. Andre stopped his frantic pacing, his expensive loafers frozen on the imported rug. Ashley paused, her hysterical weeping, her breath catching sharply in her throat. Even Yvonne remained perfectly still, her hands glued to the velvet sofa cushions, her knuckles white. "What do you mean?" Warren rasped, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. "What do you mean the buyer is not a person? I saw the LLC on the closing documents. I vetted the buyer profile myself. It was a standard corporate acquisition shell. You are talking in circles to confuse us." I let the silence stretch. I let them sit in the agonizing uncertainty for a few moments longer, watching the gears in their heads grind and spark as they tried to process a reality they were entirely unequipped to handle. I reached down and picked up my black leather folder. It was the exact same folder I had brought into this house 100 times before. The same folder they had always ignored, assuming it contained mundane administrative paperwork from a mundane career they never bothered to understand. I placed it flat on the mahogany table. The soft thud of the heavy leather hitting the polished wood made Ashley physically flinch. I rested my hand on top of the portfolio, feeling the smooth, cool texture beneath my palm. For the entirety of my adult life, I began, my voice echoing with clinical detachment. "None of you have ever asked what I actually do for a living. You knew I worked in finance. You knew I lived comfortably. But because I did not brag about venture capital or flaunt leased sports cars like Andre, you simply categorized me as a low-level clerk. You assumed I was a glorified bookkeeper pushing paper for middle management." Yvonne swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the floor. It was true. At every family gathering, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, my career was an afterthought. The spotlight was always reserved exclusively for Andre's spectacular doomed business ventures and Warren's fabricated tales of corporate dominance. I opened the black leather folder. "I do not push paper," I stated clearly. "I am a senior asset investigator. I track missing capital, dissolve fraudulent shell companies, and assist federal agencies in dismantling organized financial crime syndicates." I pulled a single thick document from the right side pocket of the folder. I did not toss it. I did not throw it. I slid it across the smooth expanse of the mahogany table with precise, deliberate force. It glided silently, coming to a perfect stop right at the edge of the table, directly in front of my father. Warren stared down at it. He hesitated to touch the paper, his hands trembling violently. He looked exactly like a man being asked to pick up a live grenade. "Read it," I commanded. Warren slowly reached out. His fingers brushed the heavy stock paper. He pulled it toward him, his eyes scanning the top of the page. I watched the last remaining traces of color drain from his face. The deep tan he had cultivated on the golf course suddenly looked like a sickly, jaundiced yellow. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Andre leaned over his father's shoulder, his eyes frantically darting back and forth across the text. "What is it?" Ashley demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. She took a tentative step forward, her resort wear rustling loudly in the quiet room. "Andre, what does it say? Tell me what it says." Andre could not speak. He just stared at the bold, imposing corporate letterhead stamped at the top of the document, followed by a dense block of irrefutable legal terminology. "I will tell you what it says." "Ashley," I offered, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. "That document is a certified recorded deed of transfer. It bears the official seal of the state registry. If you look closely at the dates, you will notice something incredibly problematic for your current legal strategy." I stood up slowly, planting my hands firmly on the edge of the table and leaning forward. "Because the house you sold wasn't mine anymore," I stated, my words striking like physical blows. "4 months ago, I transferred the deed to my employer, a global forensic accounting and asset management firm." The room erupted into total unmitigated chaos. Ashley let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She grabbed her hair, her acrylic nails digging into her scalp as she spun around in a tight, panicked circle. "You sold corporate property!" she shrieked at Warren, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "You forged a transfer for a house owned by a federal investigative firm. You absolute idiot. You dragged me into this. You made me sign my name to a cartel money laundering scheme, stealing from a forensic accounting corporation." Yvonne covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, as if she could block out the reality of her collapsing world. "Andre, do something!" Yvonne cried out blindly. "Warren, fix this. Tell her to stop." Andre was beyond fixing anything. He backed away from the table, staring at his father with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "You told me you checked the title." Andre hissed, his chest heaving. "You told me the asset was unencumbered. You arrogant, stupid old man. You walked us right into a federal trap. You completely ruined my life to cover your own debts." Warren was hyperventilating now. He dropped the document onto the table as if it were on fire. He gripped his chest, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, desperate, entirely stripped of the patriarchal dominance he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. "You set me up," Warren choked out, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at me. "You knew I was looking for capital. You knew the family was struggling. You purposely left that asset dangling to destroy me." I tilted my head, looking at him with genuine cold curiosity. "You genuinely believe the universe revolves entirely around you, do not you?" "Dad," I asked, my voice slicing through the frantic noise of the room. "You honestly think a multi-billion-dollar global intelligence firm orchestrated a massive multi-agency federal sting operation just to catch a pathetic, washed-up local businessman trying to steal his daughter's inheritance?" Warren froze, his finger still suspended in the air. "My firm was targeting Premier Title Services," I explained, forcing him to understand his absolute insignificance in the grand scheme of his own destruction. "We knew Marcus was laundering cartel money. We knew he was using out-of-state property transfers to clean the cash. But we needed undeniable documented proof of him willfully bypassing federal escrow holds to push dirty money through his specific clearinghouse. We needed bait." I gestured to the document resting on the table. "We needed a high-value, unencumbered out-of-state property with a clean history to put in front of him," I continued. "So I volunteered my brownstone. I legally transferred the deed to a holding company controlled by my firm. We seeded the property into the local market data, flagged it for rapid liquidation, and waited for Marcus to take the bait." I paused, letting the crushing weight of the irony settle over the room. "We expected a front company to approach him," I said quietly. "We expected one of his cartel associates to attempt the fraudulent purchase. We set the trap for organized criminals. I never in my wildest nightmares imagined that my own father would bypass the cartel, forge my signature, steal the bait, and walk it directly into a federal wiretap." Warren collapsed back into the velvet armchair. The fight completely left his body. He was just a hollow shell of a man crushed under the immense weight of his own greed. He looked up at me, his eyes welling with terrified tears. Fine. Warren begged, his hands clasped together in front of his chest. Fine, Zuri. We will give it back. I will drain the family trust. I will sell the cars. I will empty Yvonne's accounts. We will get the $340,000. We will wire it directly back to your firm. We can reverse the sale. Just call your bosses. Tell them it was a family dispute. Tell them I did not know it was corporate property. Just call them and cancel it. I walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. I stopped right in front of his chair. I leaned in close, bringing my face down to his level, lowering my voice to a deadly absolute calm. We were using that brownstone as a physical asset trap in an ongoing federal sting operation. You didn't steal from your daughter, Dad. The absolute silence that followed my statement was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in this house. It was the crushing, suffocating silence of total realization. Warren stared at me, his jaw slack, the skin around his eyes twitching uncontrollably as his brain desperately tried to find a loophole, a misinterpretation, any possible escape hatch from the reality I had just presented. You sold the property to my firm, I stated, my voice echoing with a surgical, unyielding precision. The holding company listed on your fraudulent closing documents is a dummy corporation wholly owned and operated by my employer. We use it exclusively to track illicit financial movements and map the operational networks of corrupt title agents. You did not liquidate a family asset, Dad. You initiated a hostile, unauthorized transfer of corporate property belonging to a multi-billion-dollar global intelligence firm. Warren gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling wheeze emerged. The patriarchal dominance he had wielded like a weapon for my entire life was utterly gone, replaced by the pathetic primal terror of a man who suddenly realized he was entirely outmatched. The funds! Warren finally choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The $340,000. If the buyer was your firm, then the money— Do not use that word, I snapped, cutting him off with a sharp glare. Do not refer to it as just money. The capital wired into Ashley's offshore account was not standard currency. It was federally marked, closely monitored bait capital provided directly by the Department of Justice. Every single dollar was digitally tagged and tracked the moment it left the escrow account. By demanding that the title company route those specific funds to the Cayman Islands, you provided the federal government with the exact international money laundering mechanism they have been trying to uncover for over a year. Ashley let out a sudden, high-pitched shriek. She scrambled backward, putting as much distance between herself and the mahogany table as physically possible, as if the documents themselves were going to reach out and arrest her. My account. Ashley gasped, her chest heaving as she stared at her hands. The Cayman account. It is in my maiden name. I gave them the routing numbers. I signed the transfer authorization. That is correct, I confirmed, offering her a cold, empty smile. And within 3 seconds of that wire transfer hitting your offshore bank, international financial authorities froze the account. You cannot access a single cent of it. Furthermore, because that account is now officially categorized as a receptacle for laundered federal funds. Every other asset tied to your name, your domestic checking accounts, your trust funds, your credit cards, has been immediately flagged and frozen, pending a full investigation. You are entirely destitute, Ashley. She let out another gut-wrenching sob, her knees buckling slightly. She looked wildly at Andre, waiting for him to step in to fix it, to use his golden child status to make the consequences disappear. But Andre was no longer the confident, visionary entrepreneur. He was completely paralyzed, his eyes wide and vacant as he stared at the floor. Warren shook his head violently, a gesture of absolute denial. He took a staggering step toward me, his hands raised in a pathetic posture of surrender. Zuri, listen to me, Warren pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, desperate register. I did not know. You have to believe me, I had absolutely no idea the property belonged to your firm. I thought I was taking what was rightfully ours. It was a mistake, a terrible, catastrophic error in judgment. But it is still just a civil matter. It is a family dispute over asset allocation. You can explain this to them. You can tell your superiors that your father made a paperwork error. I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate, pathetic rationalizations wash over me. For my entire life, I had watched this man twist the truth, manipulate the narrative, and avoid accountability by hiding behind the shield of family loyalty. He was trying to use the very bond he had repeatedly exploited to save himself from federal prison. I stepped out from behind the chair, crossing my arms over my chest, as I looked him dead in the eye. I refused to let him hide behind his delusions for 1 second longer. You committed wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny against a multi-billion-dollar corporate entity. I stated, my voice ringing through the room with absolute uncompromising authority. An entity that currently has the FBI on speed dial. The words struck the room like physical blows. The absolute finality of the statement shattered whatever fragile hope they had been clinging to. There was no spinning this. There was no negotiating. There was no paying someone off or sweeping it under the rug. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the federal government was already waiting on the other side. Andre let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal's final gasp. His legs simply stopped working. He collapsed, dropping heavily to his knees right in the middle of the dining room. The impact of his knees hitting the hardwood floor was loud and sickening. As he fell, his arm caught the handle of his expensive monogrammed leather carry-on bag. The designer luggage, packed meticulously for a celebratory first-class flight to Paris, tipped over and spilled open, a pathetic monument to a future that no longer existed. Andre did not even try to catch himself. He slumped forward, his hands resting limply on his thighs, his head bowed in total defeat. He stared at the spilled contents of his luggage, completely dead inside. The arrogant, entitled golden boy, who had demanded I hand over my life savings to fund his vanity projects, was entirely broken, reduced to a weeping, trembling mess on the floor. Yvonne screamed, her voice tearing through the heavy silence. She rushed across the room, completely ignoring her husband, completely ignoring her weeping daughter-in-law, and threw herself onto the floor next to her son. She grabbed his shoulders, trying desperately to pull him upright, trying to force him back into the mold of the strong, capable man she had always pretended he was. But Andre was dead weight. He offered no resistance, simply letting her pull at his shirt, as tears streamed down his perfectly tanned face. "Stand up, Andre!" Yvonne cried, her voice bordering on hysteria. "Stand up right now. We are going to fix this." She looked up at me from her position on the floor, her flawless aristocratic mask entirely destroyed. Her makeup was running, her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were wild with an animalistic maternal panic. She abandoned every ounce of her pride, every ounce of the cold, dismissive superiority she had always weaponized against me. "Zuri, please!" Yvonne begged, her voice cracking as she clutched her son's arm. "You have to stop this. You have to call your boss right now. You have to tell them this is a massive mistake. Tell them it was a misunderstanding between family members. Tell them we are handling the restitution internally. You cannot do this to us. You cannot send your own father and your own brother to a federal prison." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the woman who had stood in this exact room less than an hour ago and watched her husband and her son relentlessly bully me. I remembered the cold, detached expression on her face when she told me I needed to sacrifice my financial security because I did not understand the pressures of providing for a real family. I remembered her telling me that my career was meaningless compared to Andre's visionary potential. I let her frantic begging fill the room, letting the sheer hypocrisy of her desperation hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. She was perfectly willing to let me be financially ruined, perfectly willing to let me be the sacrificial lamb for their vanity. But the moment the consequences turned toward her golden child, she demanded, "I risk everything to save him." "Zuri, answer me!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. "Call your firm. Tell them it was a family misunderstanding. You owe us that much. We are your family." I tilted my head, looking down at her with an expression of profound, unbothered emptiness. I felt absolutely nothing for the people weeping on the floor in front of me. They were not my family. They were parasites who had finally attached themselves to a host they could not survive. I looked at my mother, mirroring her exact words from earlier, delivering the final, devastating blow with perfect, chilling precision. "I'm a single woman, Mom," I said, keeping my voice deadly quiet and entirely devoid of emotion. "I don't have a husband or a family to support. My loyalty is to my career now. Why would I risk my job for criminals? The heavy oak front door practically exploded inward off its reinforced hinges. Wood splintered and shattered as a dozen federal agents in dark Kevlar tactical gear swarmed into the grand foyer. The synchronized, deafening shouts of federal law enforcement commanding everyone to freeze completely paralyzed the room. Local police secured the perimeter, their radios crackling sharply in the sudden terrified silence of my parents' living room. I calmly took 2 steps back, smoothing the front of my jacket, and raised my hands where they were clearly visible. Special Agent Miller stepped through the shattered doorway. He swept the room with a hard, practiced gaze before locking eyes with me. "Good evening, David," I said, lowering my hands and reaching slowly into my breast pocket. "Evening, Zuri," Miller replied, his tone all business. "We tracked the local IP ping from the router you isolated. You have the handover." I retrieved a pristine white envelope containing my corporate identification, the federal liaison authorization codes, and the original forged property deeds Warren had submitted. I handed it directly to Miller. "The primary targets are Warren and Andre. The secondary accomplice is Ashley. All financial routing data and forged signatures are authenticated in that file." Miller nodded to his team. The agents moved with terrifying efficiency. Warren was the first to be restrained. As the heavy steel cuffs clicked around his wrists, his shock evaporated into vicious, flailing anger. He twisted his head toward Yvonne, who was cowering against the velvet sofa. "This is your fault!" Warren screamed, spit flying from his lips as an agent forced his head down. "You never stopped spending. You pushed me to secure that cash. You demanded the lifestyle. You drove me to this." Yvonne let out a piercing wail, covering her face with her hands, entirely incapable of defending herself or her shattered reality. Across the room, Ashley was fighting 2 agents like a cornered animal. Her designer dress tore at the shoulder as they forced her arms behind her back. "I did not do anything!" Ashley shrieked, her voice tearing her vocal cords. "I was forced. Andre made me sign those papers. He kidnapped me, essentially. He told me it was clean money. He is a liar and a thief. My father will have all of your badges." Andre remained exactly where he had fallen. He did not fight. He did not run. As the agent hauled him to his feet and ratcheted the handcuffs tightly around his wrists, his legs gave out completely. He hung suspended by the agent's grip, openly sobbing, his face a wet, snot-slicked mask of absolute terror. "Zuri," Andre wailed, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "Zuri, please help me. I am your brother. Please, I will do anything. Save me. Do not let them take me." I looked at him. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I felt a profound, absolute emptiness. The people who had spent a lifetime diminishing my existence were now destroying each other in front of federal agents, and I had absolutely no desire to watch the rest of the spectacle. I turned my back on his sobbing. I walked over to the mahogany table, picked up my laptop, and slid it neatly into my briefcase. I stepped carefully around Andre's spilled designer luggage, ignoring the frantic pleas echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I walked out the broken front door, past the flashing neon lights of the cruisers, and stepped into the cool, quiet evening air. 3 months later, the air inside my corner office was perfectly still and climate-controlled. I sat behind a massive glass desk, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling panoramic view of the city skyline. I clicked the mouse, opening a priority encrypted email from the federal prosecutor's office. The subject line read simply, "Case resolution." I scanned the brief factual paragraphs. Warren and Andre had both formally pled guilty to federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny, bypassing a trial entirely to avoid additional cartel-related conspiracy charges. They were both facing a mandatory 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Ashley had attempted to fight the charges, leaning on her wealthy family for a high-powered defense team. The moment the details of the cartel money laundering connection hit the national news cycle, her family completely cut her off legally and financially, severing all ties to protect their own corporate interests. She was currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial with a public defender. The brownstone deed had been successfully reverted, and the property was safely back in the firm's possession, secured and permanently locked away from any future familial interference. The heavy glass door to my office clicked open. My boss Richard walked in carrying 2 crystal flutes and a bottle of expensive vintage champagne. "The board finalized the restructuring this morning," Richard stated, placing one of the flutes on my desk and filling it with the pale bubbling liquid. "Congratulations on the promotion, senior partner. You handled a highly volatile, deeply compromised asset recovery with absolute precision." "Thank you, Richard," I replied, picking up the glass. He offered a brief, respectful nod and stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him. I swiveled my leather chair toward the window. The city stretched out below me, an endless grid of glass, steel, and moving lights. There were no phone calls to answer. There were no demands for my savings. There were no insults disguised as advice. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. It was crisp, cold, and flawless. I let the absolute unbroken peace of a truly quiet life wash over me, the ultimate lesson. True family is defined by mutual respect, not merely by bloodlines. When those closest to you constantly belittle your worth and exploit your loyalty, the most powerful response is stepping away to build your own success. You do not need the approval of toxic individuals who only value you when it serves their selfish interests. Reclaiming your financial independence, establishing firm boundaries, and refusing to let their false narrative define your reality is your absolute greatest triumph. Join the conversation. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story of resilience in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering content.